Okay. So pretty much what we're going to be doing today is going to be one of those really long-ass videos that's going to be going on to my YouTube probably tomorrow. Although instead of talking about how, you know, people misunderstand Marth or something more on the mentality side of the game, today we're going to be talking about something actually in-game that I've noticed a lot of people tend to have problems with, and it's going to be spacing. A lot of people in Ultimate seem to have a issue with spacing with Marth, and I think that mainly comes down to the misunderstanding of what spacing means for Marth in this game, and kind of in general. Today I do have Fletcher with me. Currently he's unable to speak. His mouth is taped shut. But he is here and he's going to be pretty much our practice dummy. Say Dunktastic to say hello, and that you're definitely not doing this against your will. Hell yeah. And we have our handy dandy little notepad right over here. Or right this way? Yeah, right over there. To kind of guide us through this. So spacing mainly can be broken down into two parts: positional and mechanical spacing. Now I want to talk about positional spacing first because that, in my eyes, in this game is what matters more. I will quickly define both of them as we load this up to make sure the arena doesn't die. The positional spacing is mainly your ability to use your position and your opponent's position and get in through that way. Like you're mixing in your movement around their movement and their options to get in, rather than specifically just using your hitboxes. And positional spacing can be broken down into two: committal and non-committal. Now committal spacing, which is what we'll be talking about first, because there's more overall committal options in this game than non-committal, are spacing tools that revolve committal actions. They force you to do things until they force you to do that one thing until it's done. Now dashing, especially, is going to be your main committal option that you're going to see almost every single character do constantly in this game. You have to wait until your dash is done before you can do anything. You can buffer options out of it, and it's not that long of time. But if you're only dashing around, you have very limited movement. You notice how he just completely just waited for me to dash in, and then I got F-tilted? The other most common way is going to be jumping. Jumping, mainly doing rising aerials for most characters, sometimes falling. Mainly for Marcina, it's going to be falling. Hey, Ollie. These are both committal options because in the case of dashing, there's a set amount of frames before you can do anything. It's a set distance before you can do anything else, other than things such as like jumping, which is another committal action. There's no way to cut that forced amount of frames. Jumping's committal in a completely different way, but it's still worth mentioning because there is only a set amount of frames you're in the air. And you are in the air and you can't just instantly drop down. You can fast fall, but there's no way to make Marth just instantly fall down to the ground, or any other character really. Unless there's something like ZSS down air, but that has its own committal requirements to it. So for something like jumping, there's a set amount of distance you can go when you're jumping, and it's a set amount of frames that you're in the air. So while jump squats themselves are really punishable or really all that risky anymore, so you can kind of just jump freely in terms of, I hope I get off the ground in the first place so you're not gaining anymore. It's still committal in the sense that if you get anti-aired and you suck in the air, well, you kind of just put yourself in an even worse spot. Sometimes jumping is also just a genuinely bad idea as well. Because when it comes to spacing, and you're jumping around, this again limits your total amount of movement. There's only so much you can do in the air. And the last main committal action that you can do that can use spacing, but it's usually not going to be that common, are going to be attacks. Now, Byleth actually got released pretty recently, or at least when this video came out. And they mainly use their attacks for spacing because they don't really have that good of movement, right? They're pretty slow, they have bad air excel, they don't really get a whole lot done with movement. But in terms of pure range and attack, they can use that to space instead. For Marth, you mainly want to use your movement. Your mix of committal options and non-committal options we'll get to in just a moment. Now, if you watch any Marth set, or any set with Marcina just in general, not even just Marth, what are you going to see as your two main ways of moving over anything else? Jumping and dashing. You rarely see anyone walk, and when they do, it's a walk into PCF tilt or another extremely committal option. They don't mix up what they do, they just only do committal options, and that limits what they can do. So in this game, they would come to the conclusion that Marth has a very hard time spacing, when it's that they're limiting their actions because they're only doing committal options. Now, how good are non-committal options, and what are they in this game? Well, non-committal spacing is using... or non-committal spacing tools are tools that pretty much are just... they're pretty similar, and there's not as many as committal options, but they're just things you can do, and there's no punishment for doing it, really. So if I'm walking, at any frame I can shield, I can F-tilt, I can slow down, I can speed up. I'm not punished for walking. There's no frame of walking I have to walk before I eventually have to go back into walking. I can just do whatever I want, however I want to. That comes at the cost of walking startup, and dashing startup is not going to be anywhere near as good. So if I need to get somewhere quickly, dashing is going to be better. This covers way more distance in that 19 frames or 14 frames than that does. This takes way longer, and it's not going to be as quick. So you need to mix these two together. The other main tool that you have as non-committal, and I shit you not, is standing still. Standing completely fucking still. There are times where you're going to be fighting opponents that are moving all across the fucking stage, and you just standing still puts you in the right spot for them, because they're trying to move around what you're doing, and you're just sitting there. You can do literally anything out of standing. Oh, you can even do walking from walking, stand, walk, stand, walk, stand. Some characters do have really good aerial drift. Marth is kind of one of them. He doesn't have the best airspeed at all, but he has enough aerial drift to kind of make jumps not as committal as, say, Roy, where if you dash and jump as Marth, you can kind of drift back and go, oh, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. You don't have to fully commit to that dash jump, whereas Roy, you definitely have to. You just kind of have to go, well, that's my problem now. And that's a special boon that Marth has over most characters, that he has such a non-committal movement. That is so good. He has the best walk in the game. He has really good control over himself in the air. A lot of his hitboxes, in terms of attacks that are long-reaching, are pretty safe from said non-committal positions, like down tilt. As long as you're not spamming it, F-tilt's pretty safe. If you're landing, Nair is really good to keep you in a safe position. There's a lot of tools he has, as long as you're willing to mix together your committal and non-committal options in order to space around your opponent. To kind of put you in that good spot to land attacks. Now, you're not really worrying about sours or tippers when we're talking about positional spacing. We're mainly just worrying about putting yourself in the spot to hit them. That's going to matter more in the long run than anything else. So if I'm in a bad spot, like in the corner, right? I don't have anywhere near as much stage to work with positional spacing. So I have to rely on other means. I have to wait on him to attack or force me to do something, right? I can't just walk around for free. I do have to play more committal in the corner in some cases, because he's just not going to let me in. Which you have to know how to mix in both, and that has to play around whatever your opponent's doing. Your overall goal is to use these tools together and position yourself against your opponent and the options they're using. They require, like, your positional spacing requires you to have an understanding of what your opponent wants to do. So in a ditto like this, obviously you're both doing the same thing. That's not the best example. But you're mainly trying to outspace your opponent in the ditto, right? So that means you're trying to basically just get in a better position for yourself. Maybe punish their end lag. Try and hit them out of something. Keep them at disadvantage. Move yourself in the right spot to put them in disadvantage. Wait for risky options for them. If you notice they're doing a lot of jumping, for example, how you move around, that's going to be completely different than if they're doing a lot of attacking and they're trying to keep you out by walling. You know, if they're being really aggressive or being really passive, or they're fishing for grabs, you need to space around all those options very differently. They require different answers. There's no one move you can do the whole time, or one like option. That just doesn't exist in this game. That doesn't mean you can't space, you just have to have the options there. And you need to know when to use what. And that's really hard to really say as a, you should do this for this, because it's so situational in terms of what your opponent, what their character is, what you're trying to do. There's a lot of potential answers to problems when it comes to spacing with your position. So when you're moving around and you're doing all these things, you're not moving for what you want to land. You're moving for what your opponent wants to do. And whatever your opponent wants to do, the game's gonna end. That's fine. Cool. Thank you, Xander. I appreciate it. Cool. So, that makes spacing a very matchup-dependent thing. Spacing around Samus is going to look very different around spacing against a Bowser or a Pichu, right? You need to space around different things. You need to know how to move around their options. And there's also the player matchup, you know. Fletcher, as a very good example, is a very aggressive Marth. He likes to basically put you in the corner and go, okay, I'm going to throw 4,000 things at you and you're not going to know what to do. I'm a very passive Marth, on the other hand. I like to sit kind of right out here and go, okay, so throw out a move. Okay, now you're hit. Now you're off stage. That's not very nice. So you need to work around how not only their character works, you also need to work around how that player works. And you need to pick up on these little habits very quickly. Footstools are not hype. You know, a lot of times patterns that you're looking for, especially for something like if you're spacing around set options, is probably going to be the easiest time for you for most Marths, which is why I say tech chasing is going to be very easy for most players. It's because tech chases or tech rolls are very committal options that you force. So if Fletcher, if I can hit him again, we'll just have him here. So if, let's say he's at 30%, and I hit him with, you know, a tip or fair. Or not. A tip or fair, right? He techs. Is any sort of tech option. That's something that I forced, that now he has to deal with in a way that I can always react to in the same way. If he tech rolls in, that is going to be the same spot I'm aiming for every time. You're okay, Fletcher, don't worry. If I send him off stage, it's another really good example of he has to do very specific things. I can't edgeguard to save my life. So you're working around a lot of things, and then half of them you're forcing because, well, you hit them in a bad spot. Aha, I can't edgeguard. So there's your non-committal movement and your committal movement that you're working around. they're, for the most part, committal movement, because very few characters in Ultimate are actually going to be using non-committal movement for any sort of regular part of the game. And then you also force even harder non-committal options the more an advantage you get. You know, things like tech chases off stage, edge guarding. You know, you're working on using a mix. Kind of like how this gameplay looks a bit here, although this is a bit stilted. Wow. So there's a lot going on, and every matchup's going to look a little different, so the more you understand about certain matchups and certain players, the better you're going to be able to perform, because oh, I know this character needs to be in this range to really be able to do certain things that they really want to do. So I can limit what they want to do, as long as I pressure them in that range well enough. And that tipper. Eventually, or not eventually, my bad. Now we're going to move on to mechanical spacing, which is going to be the second part of this. Mechanical spacing is what most people think of when they hear of spacing. It involves careful placement of hitboxes with pinpoint accuracy. Mechanical spacing, like I said, is probably what 99% of people are thinking when it comes to spacing with this character. You know, thinking, oh, for tippers, you have to have really good spacing. They're thinking you need to be able to always put yourself at max range. It's really not the case. Positional spacing in this game is what's going to get you those tippers, not mechanical. Most of the time. You need to be in the position to where you can land those tippers. And it's really not that easy to do in this game, if you're only going for them all the time. What's up, Dusty? We're talking about spacing. So if we're staying in this range of like tippers, right? Very much impossible for any of us to hit the other. But if we get in with like a sour spot, then there's more I can do after that. So a lot of your spacing isn't, like even your mechanical spacing isn't going to mainly be around tippers. It's mainly going to be around spacing right outside of your opponent's range, like right fucking outside. I think of a good analogy would be like if you've ever had a sibling or a really annoying friend that you probably didn't like in school, and they did that thing where they had their hand right next to you, and they're like, I'm not touching you. That's Marth in this game. That's what you're doing the entire game. That's your whole goal, is to use all kinds of dashes, walks, jumps, everything to be that annoying friend in school, and then kill them at 40. So a lot of your mechanical spacing, even if we are going to be talking about tippers, is going to be your technical ability to land them through what I've mentioned. I think a really easy way to think about it is you're using your positional spacing and your mechanical skill to land tippers, not your mechanical spacing. And your understanding of hitboxes, your understanding of how certain moves aren't going to work very well on the Z-axis. I'm going to leave the arena, so I can show some one-frame or some one-frame mode stuff. So when it comes to something like tippers, because I can help you out a little bit with this. A lot of times, most of Marth's moves are going to have frames that are going to be easier to land tippers are depending on the situation, and you need to know how to consistently get yourself to where you can use said frames to your advantage. I think a really easy example is fair. I'm not going to go over every single move. Don't worry, I'm not. But I think the easy example is going to be fair. So if we look at fair in terms of a move, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's the first active frame. Now I know I full hopped, but if I were to land this hitbox, right? At the very top, right? So at the very top of the blade is where the tipper is, and pretty much the angled down is where the sour is. Most of the time, if I'm landing on someone, the sour spot's going to land first. The reason being is because the tipper is higher, so you have less room to work with in order to actually get the tipper. If I move on to the next frame, I have the most horizontal range to work with. So if I'm at an equal kind of height for the most part with my opponent, I want to be using frame 7. If I'm going to be landing on someone, it's going to be really easy to use frame 8, because that's going to be the opposite of frame 6. You're aiming the tipper down, so now it's going to be harder to land the sour spot. A really good example of this is, let's say, right here. Well, here. I think I'd have to be right there, probably. Wow, okay. I even forgot my character's range for a minute. So around right here. So it would still probably connect as a sour here. That definitely connects as a tipper there. And if I'm landing on someone, I can even be closer as long as I land. But if I'm like right there for frame 7, it wouldn't work. But if I'm like, I hit with frame 7, I can be closer. And it'll be alright. Frame 8's really hard to land. But you notice how that's going to be a lot easier to tipper than if I did this. So if I'm going for that frame, that's going to be way harder to land a tipper than the other two frames. With the exception of them being in the air. If they're jumping, it's going to be way easier to catch with the first frame as a tipper, because now the inverse is true, where now the top part's where the tipper is. And that's going to take priority, in the sense of not actual priority, but it's going to be a lot easier to get the tipper there, because they have to go through the tipper first. So as long as you have decent spacing and decent timing, you don't have to be as pinpoint as if you would with the bottom frame in this case. That's gonna be way harder to land. Like, I don't think that's really hard. And I'll do one more example with this real quick. So another one would be F smash. F smash is pretty much in the same where, and I'll do this here first. I think that's frame 10. That's probably frame 10. Right above you, frame 10, and then frame 11 are going to be really good on catching above you. But again, with that same problem where the sword is at an angle, it's not going to land on vertical opponents, or like that's going to be on the same horizontal plane with you. You're really going to wait. You're really going to want to land frames 12 and 13 instead of 10 and 11. You want those two frames instead, because it's going to be way easier to land on the same spot as you than right there, right? Those definitely should be landing, right? That's because it's connecting with the sour first. This is at a really weird angle. Where if I do right, shit, right there, there's way more leeway for frames 12 and 13, where there's not really any leeway for frame 11. Because if you're looking at the hit lag, it's stopping at 11 first. Where that's pretty much the only way I'm going to be able to really easily get the tipper is going to be on frame 12. So that's a lot of what you're working around. Now, I heavily recommend going into Marcina Chord, looking at your hitboxes and going, okay, so at what point is they're going to be easy to land against someone that I'm trying to edge guard. Probably that frame, and that frame in particular, are going to be the way easier ones to do. Instead of the very first frame on the side. Because that tipper is going to be so far down, and that angle is going to be so steep. It's going to be it's going to be insane to try and land that. Like, you pretty much have to be perfectly spaced for the very first frame of bear, or else it's not going to tipper because of that horrendous angle the sword itself is at. It's not that the tipper's too small, it's that you're almost always going to connect with the sour spot first. Just because realistically speaking, it's going to be very hard to land that frame instead of this frame. There's way more leeway here. So that's a lot of what you're working with when it comes to spacing mechanically. So overall, a lot of what you're working on in this game for spacing shouldn't be mechanical spacing, because mechanical spacing is only going to get you so far in terms of flat movement. There's no wave dashing in this game, there's no pivot cancels, there's no, well, there's pivot cancels, there's no perfect pivoting, my bad. So a lot of that free-flowing movement that you had in other games is gone. Not that Smash 4 really had free-flowing movement to begin with, but especially in Melee, you're not going to have that kind of movement, or that free-flowing movement, to always put yourself in the right position. And you can't rely on, so you can't rely on just your mechanical spacing anymore. You have to be able to use your positional spacing, which involves a lot of understanding what your opponent wants to do and move yourself accordingly to what they want. Like I said, every character is going to be a little different. And that's where the challenge, I think, with Marth lies, is that you have to understand what a lot of characters are wanting to do to put yourself in the right spot to properly respond. Anyways, I'm pretty sure that's going to be it for just the Fr0stumentary. That was way quicker than I thought. But I realized having someone with me would make that a lot easier. I was actually scared that I was going to go on for way too fucking long for that, to be honest. So now that that's done, let's see.